So in this video, we're going to be creating a multi-page website that's going to allow you to securely register users into a MySQL database. You'll then be able to log in with those users and have their information persist throughout the entire website. So we're going to want to start out by cding into the directory that we're going to want to store the files. We're then going to run npm create next app, and then the name of the app we want to create, which in this case we're going to call login register. After that's finished running, we can cd into that file and open it up in VS Code. We can then delete a bunch of the boilerplate that comes along with that and just create a simple template for now. We're also going to want to get rid of any styling that comes default with NextJs and the imports involved with that. And now we can go ahead and get started with installing our dependencies. We're going to need NodeMon for automatically restarting our server. We're going to need Axios for sending HTTP requests. We're going to need bcrypt for encrypting our passwords. Cores for handling the location of our HTTP requests. Express for making our backend web framework. Express session for managing our session middleware. Cookie parser for parsing cookies with our users' information. MySQL for handling our SQL connections and queries. And finally, Passport and Passport Local for authenticating our users. After installing our dependencies, we're going to want to create a register page where users can sign up for an account. We're going to do this by creating a register.js file and putting it in our pages folder. We're going to create just a simple register page function that's going to return a div with the text register in it. Then we can go ahead and run the command npm run dev, and this will get a development server started on our local machine. Now if we go to localhost, you can see that we have a home page and a register page. So this is going to be the basic template for our app, and then we're going to build it up from here. On our register page, we're going to want to have a couple of inputs so that the user can enter in their information. The first input we're going to want to have is the person's username. It's going to be of type text, and we're going to go ahead and call it username. And it's also going to have a placeholder of username. We're going to copy the input that we use for the person's username and change the type, name, and placeholder to password. After that, we're going to create a button where the user can actually submit the request. Opening up Chrome, we can see the changes that we have made to the website, except none of it actually has any functionality yet, so we need to go ahead and add that. We're going to want to store our usernames and passwords. To do this, we're going to use the React hook useState. I'm hoping that if you're watching this video, you have a good idea on how React hooks work. If you don't, I'd really recommend watching a video on that and then coming back to this video. Then to update our username, we're going to use the onChangeEvent attribute and write a simple arrow function to set the username to e.target.value. And this is going to give us whatever we're typing into the username field. And all of this front-end code should be pretty simple until we start getting into some of the back-end code. We're just going to copy exactly what we did for the username input and paste that right in for the password. And we're also going to change the function to the setRegisterPassword function. Then we can go ahead and console log that just to make sure that the changes we made actually are working on the front end. And as you can see, as soon as we start typing into the username field, it is being console logged on the right. We can go ahead and get rid of that console log for now, and we're just going to copy that and make a whole new page. This is going to be for logging in the users, and we can paste that so we can start building off of it. We can change the name of the function to login and the title to login. And then we're also going to want to change the variables in our use state to log in instead of register. We're also going to want to do the same for the onChange functions, and make sure you change the button on the bottom as well. Now that we have a simple login and register page, we need a way for our users to be able to easily navigate between the two. We're going to do that by creating a components folder and then a file called navbar.js. Inside that, we're going to create a navbar function, and this function is just going to return some basic links so that the user can easily switch between the pages. After creating our navbar component, we're going to want to go ahead and place it at the top of all of our pages. And as you can see, the changes have been made, but it looks pretty bad, so we're going to add just a little bit of styling just to make it look a little bit better. And I accidentally set the wrong link in the profile part of the navbar, so go ahead and set that to be just the index page. Then we're going to create a file for our navbar styling. That's just going to have a name of navbar.module.css. And then just feel free to copy what I'm putting down in here. All we're really doing is just changing the direction of the text and then changing the color to a different color. Then we're going to want to import the styling that we just wrote and then apply it to our HTML. Now we have a simple looking navbar that takes us between our different pages on our site. And this is pretty much going to be all we need for the front end code. So now we're going to go ahead and get started on the back end side. We're going to start by creating a folder named server. And then inside that folder, we're going to create a file called index.js. And this file is going to hold our Express server that's pretty much going to handle all of our API requests, like logging in users, registering users, anything that requires getting information from the database. And basically at the top of the index file, we're going to be importing all of our dependencies that we installed at the beginning. Now we're going to run app.listen, and we're going to give it a port and an arrow function. And this arrow function is just going to console log that the server is up and running. We're also going to want to change the port to 3001 because React is running on port 3000. Now to get the Express server started, you're going to want to open up your package.json file and create a custom script called server. And that server script is going to run nodemon and then the directory to your index file. Now what nodemon does is every time you save your index file, it's going to automatically restart your server so that you don't have to do it manually. Now we can start up nodemon by running the command npm run server, and then this will start up our custom script that we made. Now heading over to localhost 3001, we can see that the server is running, but we're not actually getting anything from it. Now just to make sure that the API is working, we're going to add a GET request into our index.js file. We do this by running app.get, followed by the location, and an arrow function with request and response. And inside that function, we're going to do response.send, and then the message that's going to be sent when that GET request is made. So if you navigate over to localhost 3001, you can see that that GET request is actually responding with our message. Now we're going to be setting up the middleware on our Express server. And I'm kind of going to just write all this down for now and then try to explain it towards the end. It's not totally necessary for you to understand what all of these things are doing. And some of them are just required to get Express working properly. Next up, we're going to be installing MySQL Workbench and MySQL Server. If you already have a program that you use to access your MySQL server, then you can just go ahead and use that. But for this example, we're going to be using MySQL Workbench because that's what I find easiest to use. So I'll have the link for the download in the description, and you can just follow along with the settings that I choose. So when selecting the type of install, we're going to choose to do a custom install. And for the products, we're going to choose the most up-to-date version of MySQL Server and MySQL Workbench. For me, that's going to be version 8, but it might be different for you. After selecting the products, we're just going to go ahead and hit next and then execute that. And that should be all that we need to get started. For the rest of the setup, we're just going to leave everything as default. And for your password, you can just enter whatever you'd like. Now that we have SQL Workbench running, we can go ahead and enter our password that we entered before. We're going to open up our schemas, and then we're going to create a new schema. For this name, we're just going to call it the same name that we called our NextJS project, which is login register. And we can go ahead and apply the default settings. Opening up our new schema, we can go ahead and add a table. And this table is going to hold the accounts of our users, so we're just going to call it account. For the columns, we're going to need to give every user an ID. This ID is going to auto increment, so every time that a user is created, the number automatically goes up. They're also going to have a username of type varchar, and we're going to set the max length on that to 45 and set it to not null. Then they're also going to have a password. That's also going to be varchar, but we're going to set that to 120. And that is also going to be set to not null. We can go ahead and hit apply to make the changes to our table. And now we have a working table where we can store the username and password of our users. Now that we have this database, we need a way for our API to actually be able to read from it. So we're going to start off by creating a db.js file and putting that in our server directory. We're going to import MySQL, and then we're going to create a variable called db that's going to hold the connection to our SQL server by running mysql.createPool. Now createPool is going to take in 5 parameters. We're going to need to give it a connection limit that we're going to set to 10. We're going to need to give it a host name, which for us is going to be localhost because it's running on our machine. We're going to give it a username of root. We're also going to enter the password that we set when setting up MySQL server. And finally, you're going to need to set the name of your database, which for us is going to be login register. Finally, we can export that variable by running module.export and then the database. We can then go back into our index file and import that database at the top. Now that our backend has access to our database, we need to make a route for our register post requests. And from that request, we're going to be able to get the register username and password from request.body.username and request.body.password. Now, I kind of started to write my queries out of order here, but basically what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to have 2 queries, one for inserting the username and password, and then another one to make sure that the username isn't already taken. This first query is going to be for inserting the username and password, and the second one is for making sure that the username is not already taken. So we're going to run db.query, and we're going to pass it in that second query that checks whether or not there's already a username taken. We're going to pass it the username that we get from request.body, and then we're going to insert an arrow function that either gives us an error or a result. Now if we receive an error, we're going to throw it, and if result.length is greater than 0, we're going to respond back with a message that says the username is already taken. Because if result.length is greater than 0, that means that we found a user. And if result.length is equal to 0, then we know that there is no user with that username taken. So after we're certain that there's no user with that name, we're going to go ahead and take their username and pass it through something called bcrypt, which is going to encrypt their password so that it can't be read in plain text. And after we have the encrypted password, we're going to make a second query that actually inserts the username and encrypted password into the database. And if we insert into the database without any errors, we're going to send a response of user created. So now that we finished writing our post request on our backend, we need a way for our front end to actually be able to send a post request to our backend server with the information needed. And to do that, we're going to be using Axios. And all Axios does is just send HTTP requests, and it's actually really easy to use. We're just going to create a function called register, and inside that function, we're going to call Axios. Axios is going to take a couple of parameters. We're going to need to give it the type of HTTP request, which in this case is going to be a post request because we're sending data. We're going to need to give it the data that we're actually sending, which is going to be our register username and register password. It's also going to take in a parameter called with credentials, which in this case we're going to set to true. And then finally the actual URL of the post request, which for us is going to be localhost/register. And just to test that the post request is actually working, we're just going to console log the response for now. We're then going to tie our register function to our register button by using the onClick attribute, and then calling the register function. So now if we go to our register page, enter a name and password, and click the register button, you'll see that the response of the post request is console logged with the message user created. So now you'll see that when we refresh our MySQL table, that we actually have the username and the encrypted password. So now that users are actually able to register into our database, it's finally time to set up Passport. To do this, we're going to throw in one final file into our server folder, and we're going to call this file passport.config. We're going to want to import three things here. We're going to want to import DB to actually access our database. We're going to need bcrypt for comparing our unhashed passwords. And we're going to need local strategy from Passport. And similarly to our database file, we're just going to export this by running module.export. So now we actually need to define our local strategy. And what our local strategy does is it's going to authenticate our users by comparing their username and password to what we have stored in the database. We're going to do this by running new local strategy, and local strategy is going to take in three parameters. We're going to need to give it a username, a password, and done. We're then going to write a SQL query that's going to look for the username in the database. We're then going to pass the username through that query, and if we get an error, we're just going to throw it. But if result.length is equal to 0, we're going to return the done callback function with a response of null and false. And basically what this is saying is that we didn't have an error, but we also didn't find a username that matched. All we need to do this is run bcrypt.compare and then pass it the unhashed password with the result that we get from our database. And that's either going to give us an error or a response. So if we get an error, we're going to throw it. But if response is equal to true, that means that the password matched up with the password in our database. And we're going to want to return the done callback function with a response of null and the result from our database. And if we get any other response, we're going to want to return done with a response of null and false. Next up, we're going to be creating the functions to serialize and deserialize our user. All the serialization function is going to do is it's going to create a cookie with the user's information on it. And the deserialization function is going to take that cookie and get the information back out of it. Now, all you need to do is run passport.serializeUser and then return the done callback function with a response of null and the user's ID. Now, deserializing our user, we're basically going to be taking that cookie that we created using serializeUser, and we're basically going to be getting the information from that cookie. So we're going to do that by taking the ID that we got from the cookie, and this is actually going to match up with what we have in our database. If we get an error, we're going to throw the error, but if we don't, we're going to create a variable called user information, and inside here, we're going to store the user's ID and their username. We can then use done and return a response of null and the user's information. Then back in our index file, we're going to want to require our passport config file and then pass it the instance of passport that we're using. And this is going to allow us to use the same instance of passport throughout our entire file. We can then go ahead and create the post route for logging in our users. We're going to do this by running passport.authenticate and then pass it a string of local to let it know that we're using our local strategy. That's going to give us a response of error, user, and info. If we get an error, we're going to throw the error. And if we can't find a user, we're going to respond back saying that no user exists. But if we do find a user, we're going to run request.login and pass it that user variable. And again, if we get an error, we're just going to throw that error. But if we don't get an error, we're going to respond back to the user with a message saying that the user was signed in. We're also just going to console log the user variable just to test that it's working properly. And to finish off our login function, we're going to need to add request, response, and next at the end of it. And this is just something that you need to make it work properly. And finally, the last request we're going to make is going to be a GET request. And this is just going to get the user's information and return it back to the front end. So we're going to call this getUser. And all this is going to do is send a response with the user. And this user variable is going to contain what we define in our passport file, which in this case is going to be the ID and username. Now, just like we did in our register page, we're going to create a function for logging in our user. And this function is going to call Axios and take in a couple of parameters. We're going to need to define the type of request, which for us is going to be a post request. We're going to need to pass it some data, which for us is going to be the username and password. We're going to set with credentials to true. We're going to define the URL, which is going to be localhost login. And just for testing, we're going to console log the response. We're also going to want to make sure that we connect the login button to the login function by using the onClick attribute. And this should be all we need to log in the user. Now I'm actually getting an error here because I forgot to import Axios at the top of our login page. So now if we refresh and enter our information again, we should get a console logged response saying that the user was logged in. Now for the final thing we want to do is we're going to want to display the user's information on the profile page. So we're going to head into our profile page, which for us is going to be our index file. And we're going to create a useState variable for our username. We're also going to want to make sure to remember to import Axios this time. So because we don't have any kind of buttons on this page, we're going to be using the useEffect hook, which is going to run every time the page loads. And inside the useEffect hook, we're going to call a function called getUser that we'll write here in a minute. Inside the getUser function, we're just going to use Axios to make a GET request to localhost 3001/getUser. And if that GET request is successful, we're going to set username to our request.data.username, and this will hold the username of whoever's logged in. We can then take our username and place it inside of our h1 tag, and this is going to be all that we need to finish the profile page. So now if we go back to our login page and enter in the information that matches with our database, you'll see that when we click the login button, we get a message of user created in the console. Then if we go over to our profile page, you can see that the user's information is displayed. So that's going to be the end of this video. If you have any questions on PassportJs, make sure to leave them in the comments and I'll try to get back to every single one of them.